be showing you how to install the sliding glass door kit for your Haven Lock device. As you'll see here, we've got our Haven already set out. It comes with its spacer, and then the kit comes with a bracket, a piece of tape, VHB tape, and two self-tapping screws. So you can see these items here. This is what we'll need to install in terms of hardware. But the first thing we want to do is determine which kit you need. And the best way to do this is go to our sliding glass door fit and sizing guide. That's got a separate video as well as guide instructions for you. So that's the best place to start there. But for this particular situation, let's just assume we've already done that. We know that based on the size of the door here, we'll need a option B kit, which sticks out a little bit further here to engage with the Haven Lock. What we want to do now, since I've already removed the toe molding, is to put the lock in the position that we determined already is the best for fitment. In this particular case, you'll see that the option B kit slides up nicely right in front of the door. It's perfectly in front of it. You can step on that foot pedal every single time to engage it, and also open the sliding door, open and closed. Gives you the best kind of place to position the lock. So what I'd like to do here is just talk a little bit about how you position the bracket. And the best way to do that is make sure that the lock is all the way pushed up against this frame ledge here. The next best thing to do is, now that you've got it into position here, you want to determine where the bracket goes and where to mark your holes for this particular bracket, as well as the lock. So in this situation, you can see that when the lock is engaged, the side of the bracket will make contact with the locking gate. What I'd like to do is take a pencil or a pen to mark the sides here of the lock, as well as the position of the bracket. The best way to determine the position and height of the bracket is to use two things. One, you've got your kind of spacer card that you got with your lock, and you also have pennies, which you should have at the house, to kind of put some position underneath this bracket here. The reason this is important, either using pennies or your bracket under your spacer card underneath, is to determine how high up that bracket needs to go while still making contact with the side of this lock. And the reason that is important in terms of spacing the bracket up, twofold. One is when you open the door, sometimes these frames are uneven, so you don't want to put the bracket in all the way setting on top of this when you install it, because the levelness of the frame could be uneven throughout, and you would end up actually pushing the bracket up or down. So you use the pennies here to kind of space and mark your holes out. And from this point, you would use the spacer to determine how much space is necessary in between the bracket and the lock, so that you at least have some kind of gap in spacing distance here, so you don't get any binding on this gate and this bracket. So at this point, I've got it somewhat positioned to where I want it. I'm just going to make it a little bit closer to make sure that it's perfectly lined up. I'll go ahead and mark these locations with a pen, and then also on the edge here just to kind of mark where the lock goes, and we'll clean that installation of the lock up at the end. All right, at this point we're going to talk about some things to note before you go and actually install the bracket on the glass. Again, we talked about making sure that this bracket is close to this locking gate, and you'll see in some of the installation materials and figures that it's really important to get this bracket close to the locking gate. But at the same time, another thing to note is that you don't want to get these screw holes up close to where the glass is fitted into the actual door. So typically this glass right here will sit about a ½ inch to a ¼ inch into the door. That's where it's actually housed within the door. And you don't want to install this bracket up so high that these screws, if you decide to use screws, goes into the glass. It'll just crack it. So you can see on this door right here, you can actually feel it with your finger. And in some doors you can actually see the line, but I can feel where the glass is actually seated into this door. And I know from here, from my guides, that my screws are well below it. And so if I was going to use screws, which in this installation I'm going to show you how to use screws, but if you're using the VHB tape only or construction adhesive, that'll give you more freedom to move up and down if you're not using screws. One other item I'd like to address as well is making sure that you have the right height adjustment of this lock as you position this bracket. So we talked a little bit about how this bracket is positioned on the door, how to space it out properly, but to get the best bite on the lock here, it may be necessary for the height to be raised up of the lock. So in this particular installation, we're gonna mark our holes, as I indicated, with one spacer underneath, because if you'll know just visually looking at it when you look at the side with your kit, you'll know that a spacer is probably required so that it grabs the most bite on the edge of the lock here. So we're going to use one spacer in this particular instance, but again, refer to the fit and sizing guide so that you know exactly how many spacers you could potentially need in which bracket kit, option A or option B, you'll need. But from this point, we're going to go ahead into securing the bracket with the VHB tape right onto the portion of the sliding glass door. So I've already got the VHB tape on here, and one thing to note is once you attach this, you want to make sure that you don't come close to these screw holes at all. You may need to trim it depending on the size that comes in the kit. It should be about the distance shown here, but you don't want to have the screw holes interfere with this tape, because if you do that, it'll just bind and it'll get caught and it'll be a messy installation. So I'm going to show you how to affix this to the sliding glass door, and then how to use the self-tapping screws. Again, this is a vinyl door, but for doors that are steel or harder aluminum, you may need to drill pilot holes, which refer to the paper installation manual for that, on how to install that. All right, at this point, we have measured where the lock and marked where the lock needs to go, and we're using this orange spacer to kind of get some placement between the edge of the bracket here and the side of the gate. So once I kind of have that lined up, I still use the pennies as a guide, just helps me, and then I know if I go further right, or correction, further left on the bracket, I know exactly where my point is that I need to push firmly back. So I use at this point the guide of the pennies, and I place the bracket right on to the slider here, and it's in perfect position here. The pennies still fit underneath. The orange spacer card did its job by giving me some gap distance over there. Now from the next step here, now that I've kind of used the mark guide holes here to place the VHB tape, is I install the self-tapping screws. So I'm going to go ahead and use this to install the first one on the right, and then I'll show the one on the left. All right, now before I install using the self-tapping screw, I just wanted to show you what a proper install looks like of this bracket. You saw it didn't take very long to install it, but now that I've got the gate down, I can see the bracket open smoothly. It's completely even, has enough space. It slides over the top of the lock. And when I reactivate it, that spacer allowed for enough space in there so that it doesn't hit the edge of this lock when it pops up. So that's really important to note. All right, from here I'm going to install the self-tapping screw, and we'll finish up this portion of the install. Okay, so you'll see we installed the self-tapping screw on the right. We're just going to do it on the left now. So you can see sometimes there's a little bit of ribbing on the inside of these doors. So the best way to install it is push against the bracket and install right through the sliding glass fitment section. Okay, that one's installed securely. You don't want to go in too far because you could puncture on the other side depending on how thick your sliding glass door is. You also don't want to strip the sliding glass door out. So now the bracket is properly installed using the VHB tape and the screws. If you're a little skittish and you want to use construction adhesive, the best thing that I can recommend for you to use is something you can find at Lowe's or Home Depot. This particular construction adhesive that we're going to use is Gorilla Glue, and that glue can be found in the adhesive section, but you'd simply just cover the back of the bracket on this side to try to get as much of it at the top and around the sides as this is possible. Then you can just follow the same fit guide instructions and attach it to the door. So one warning I did want to cover just in a little bit more depth is this glass here. Again, we talked a little bit about how that sits a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch into this frame here. But if you follow this guide instructions and your door is shorter here, I seriously recommend that you bypass the screws and you just use one of the two, either one or the other adhesive options. If you do drill close to this glass and you crack it, unfortunately that's kind of at your own risk. Also, if you crack the glass and it does shatter or something, it could injure someone. So you really need to take heed to this warning and caution. All right, so at this point, the Haven lock is secured to the floor. Again, I recommend you use install.havenlock.com. Either click MEC or Connect, and it will show you exactly how to install this into your floor. We're just abbreviating this video in this guide, but the install of the lock into the floor is pretty much the same for sliding glass door versus a double or front door. Just obviously in this installation, we're getting the proper fitment and adjustment. But again, make sure you know your subfloor. There's only wood screws in the box, and if you use wood screws on a concrete subfloor, you'll strip out the screws and potentially damage your floor. So knowing that first is pretty important. Again, also when you're installing the lock, you want to make sure that you don't over tighten the screws and strip them out. With these Tapcons, they'll tell you pretty close to when they're tight. The drill will either start to hit its anti-torque feature and start to click. So just wanted you to be mindful of that. But at this point, the lock is secure to the floor, and the next step I'm going to show you is how to reattach this gate to the lock on the other side of the door and screwing it in to the actual gate. So gate cover at this point will be installed. All right, so at this point we've reinstalled the gate cover on top, and now we've just got to secure it via these 4 screw holes here. As you'll notice, this frame ledge is pretty even with the top of the gate when it's raised, and the best way to kind of get in there, and again, these screws aren't built for strength, they're just built to hold the gate on, but you can stick your finger in on either the left or the right side and use a small screwdriver to install the screws. So I recommend just putting a little top cover pressure on the gate. That's one way to do it. Or if you get to a point where you don't have enough leverage on maybe some of the internal positions, is you can use your finger. So I start it there, and then you can use your finger to kind of tighten it in. So you'll notice how it's just kind of going in ever so slightly. Again, this is just to hold it on. There's nothing that's going to actually come across this other than your foot, and these screws do a great job of it. So you'll see that all of them are in there pretty flush. You'll be able to test from the other side. And then the last thing to note is if you do drop a screw in here, you got to be careful to make sure that you don't drop anything in there. If you do, you'll have to fish it out. But as you can see, I installed those 2 without a problem. Now the gate cover's back on and you're ready to test out your installation.